Spectre Vision Radio.
About 15 years ago, I had what some people might call a midlife crisis. For me, it didn't take on the form of buying a car I couldn't afford or starting a relationship with someone younger. Instead, I was invaded by a paralyzing fear that I'd made nothing of myself and that my existence was meaningless. I just felt empty. I let that hollow feeling consume me for a while. But when it got to the point that my days consisted of little more than watching TV in sweatpants, I knew I had to do something. But what? I eventually decided to try to fill the hole inside me with travel, hoping all the cliches about how enriching it was, how broadening your horizons could refresh and renew, were true. But instead, in a small town in a foreign land, I learned that my life was just a spectacle. I won't say its name as I don't want anyone else going there, but it was a peculiar place that I immediately felt great unease towards as I drove through its almost empty streets. A few ghostly souls sat on park benches while others walked along with the aid of sticks. For the short time I'd been trying to locate the hotel the only English speaker I could find in the previous town had directed me toward, I didn't see anyone who wasn't old. Not only did they all look ancient, they all appeared to be suffering. Needing comfort, I squeezed Alex's hand, who was as silent and still as ever beside me in the passenger seat. My guidebook would have been helpful in deciphering street names had there been any, but I could see none of the enigmatic symbols that still appeared so alien to me when I squinted out of the car window in the dim evening fade. As I turned back to face the road, a small girl ran right out in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, stopping mere inches away from her tiny body. But she didn't even seem to notice I'd almost hit her, and continued running, her long ponytail flapping behind her, bouncing against her back with each small leap. I followed her trajectory with my eyes. She made her way to a building which had a handful of old cars parked in front of it, and pushed open the front door with both hands. I peered at the sign, which I now saw was nailed to the wall beside it. I couldn't read it, but at the bottom in bizarrely small lettering was the word hotel in English. I pulled my car over into a small clearing opposite the building and stopped the engine. I hoisted my bag out of the back seat and tucked Alex inside, not wanting people to raise eyebrows at a grown man carrying around a doll, let alone an outsider who had bought it with him on his travels. I pushed open the door to the hotel, which groaned as if I had disturbed its slumber, and went through into the lifeless lobby. The walls were plain off-white with no decorations in the form of hanging paintings or anything else for that matter. Ahead of me, an old man was standing behind a desk which had nothing on it but a clipboard and a few pens. He didn't even appear to have a computer. I approached him, my footsteps echoing awkwardly in the dead silence of that place. His eyes darted up towards me. I greeted him, but he didn't smile. I coughed nervously before trying some of the phrases I could recite from the guidebook by memory. It seemed to have done the trick as the old man turned around, bent down slowly, and retrieved a long silver key which he dropped onto the surface of the counter in front of him and pointed for me to pick it up. I asked how much it would be for one night, which also seemed to work, as he picked up his pen and drew the answer in big numbers. I paid and wandered off, knowing he wasn't about to show me to my room. I was almost positive the symbol on the tag attached to the key said 9, but I checked my guidebook just to make sure. When I opened the door, I was greeted by an old-fashioned room which seemed to be perfectly square in shape. It seemed to be in pretty good condition, apart from being a little basic. Again, no effort whatsoever had been made to give the place any color or character. I took Alex and a few other essentials out of my bag. Unable to shake the strange feeling I'd been experiencing since arriving in that town, I decided to go to sleep. I thought I was probably just tired, and that I'd see things with new eyes after some rest. My sleep was utterly dreamless, heavy and nondescript. I seemed to just close my eyes and reopen them a second later, only to realize the dim gray wash of dawn was beginning to creep in between the blinds. I got up, dressed, and gathered the few items I'd bothered to bring in from the car. I put the stuff into my bag and placed Alex on the top of the pile, before carefully clasping it shut over his little head. Downstairs, I searched for the old man to give back the key, but he was nowhere to be seen. I called out but got no reply, and after a few minutes, I realized he wasn't coming, so I headed past the reception. Outside the back of the hotel was a small garden. It was closed in by a long concrete wall, which was almost entirely engulfed by the leaves of the trees that swayed just above it. By that far wall was the small girl I'd almost hit with my car. She was sitting on a plastic, luminously pink chair in front of a small plastic table of the same color. I saw that she was playing with a toy tea set, pouring and sipping invisible liquid and nodding and smiling to guests who weren't really there. Turning and noticing me, she waved. I smiled and waved back. She pointed at the spare chair across from her, signaling for me to join her. I trudged over, keen to try and apologize for almost hitting her, although I had no idea how I would get past the language barrier. I dropped my bag and sat down, my large frame causing the miniature chair to feel as if it was about to snap. Suddenly, the girl spoke, slowly and calmly. I had no idea what she was saying, but her voice startled me. It sounded far too mature for her age, too deep and commanding. I looked at her, puzzled. She spoke again and seemed to be repeating what she'd initially stated, this time even more slowly, her mouth twisting and contorting into exaggerated shapes. Everything about her seemed to have changed with the revelation of that voice. Her movements had gone from being childish and erratic to strong and precise. She put down the plastic teapot with a steady hand and then placed both of her palms on the table and stared at me. Her eyes looked like dark, pensive pools that held far too much information for the small frame they resided within. She got up and went over to where some of her toys were scattered on the ground and picked up a child-size yellow shovel. She walked back over to me, arm outstretched, and with a flick of her head gestured for me to take it. Unnerved, I grabbed it. She turned and went over to the wall where the trees hung over. She was looking down at the ground, pacing back and forth as if she was trying to find something. Eventually, she settled on a spot and pointed down towards it. She then motioned for me to dig. I don't know why I obliged, but I did. Maybe it was sheer curiosity. Maybe the surreal nature of the situation I found myself in had put me into a suggestible daze. She watched me as I scooped up the moist earth, focused and unmoving as she surveyed my progress. Then the edge of the shovel hit something hard. I crouched down and brushed away dirt from its surface. It appeared to be a small, decorative box. I hoisted it out with both hands, walked over to the miniature table and set it down. The box was crimson red, with gold trimmings around the hinges of the slightly arched top. I smoothed my hands over its body and noticed a tiny padlock clasping its lid down firmly. When I turned to look at the girl, she was brandishing a small key in the palm of her hand, offering it up towards me. I inserted it into the opening and turned it with ease, and then tossed it aside, letting it fall to the ground. The girl let out a gruff cry as she picked it up, glaring at me angrily. She cradled it in her hand as if it were precious. When I first opened the box, my mind wasn't ready to make sense of its contents. It all just appeared to be a mess of papers torn from various notebooks or diaries. I picked one at random and pulled it out. I felt my breath catch in my throat when I saw scribbles in what was unmistakably my handwriting. It read as follows. I found a videotape amongst the things under my parents' bed. There were no labels on it. Curiosity steered me straight back to my room, and I watched it. I froze at the realization of what the words were depicting. I knew exactly what it was. It had happened when I was 9 years old, and I'd lay on my bed desperately clutching Alex for hours after seeing what was on that tape. But here it was, narrated as if from my current voice. I crumpled the page up in my hand and threw it aside, expecting some kind of reaction of protest from the girl. Instead, she stood there silently, staring at me with unwavering patience. I turned back to the box and picked up another page. A kid at school pulled my pants down. Someone who was meant to be my friend. Everyone laughed. When I was at his house a few weeks later, I thought about flushing his beloved pet hamster down the toilet as a way to get back at him. Again, it was something I had thought, but something I'd kept locked away inside of myself. As I frantically made my way through more pages, I realized they all depicted things I had thought, but never written down. Inappropriate or unacceptable urges, things I shouldn't have seen, unwholesome fantasies. The pages read like my secret thoughts had been scooped out of my mind and offered up as some kind of confessional I had no control over. Like the pages of a journal I'd never written, but was categorically mine. "What is this?" I screamed at the little girl. She appeared completely unfazed by my outburst. She raised her small hand once again and pointed past me. I followed the invisible line from her finger, and my eyes fell upon my bag. I ran over to it and picked it up, unclasping it and turning it upside down, shaking it violently, the contents spilling out onto the dry grass. The little girl bent over and picked up Alex, raising him so his mouth was at her ear. She moved his head back and forth, as if he were whispering something to her, and then laughed. A cold-hearted, merciless howl. I stumbled into her and snatched Alex from her hands, causing her to topple over as my body crashed into hers. She sat there, staring up at me unblinking for a moment, before her eyes filled with tears. She began crying, this time making the unmistakable sound of a child in disarray. I looked over my shoulder, but no one was rushing to see what the outsider was doing to cause a child such discontent. But I knew it was only a matter of time. Without hesitating further, I bundled Alex and the rest of my belongings into my arms and fled. I jumped into my car and got out of that town as quickly as I could. As I drove through the seemingly never-ending nothing, I was unable to take even so much as a peek at the passenger seat. Unable to look at Alex, to consider that he was somehow watching me. That somehow, he always had been. But I knew what had to happen, knew it in my bones. I reached a rundown farm and pulled over. I did my best to grope around for Alex, not wanting to look at him. My fingers found his familiar shape. I snatched him up and exited my vehicle. It didn't take me long to find something that could perform the function I needed. Behind a decrepit old shack, I found what I thought looked like some kind of wood chipper. The power cable running from it disappeared into the shack. I couldn't see anyone around, but I hoped it still worked. Hell, I hoped the place still had any power at all. I pushed what I guessed was the on button, and the wood chipper whirred into life. I wanted to throw Alex in there without a second thought, but instead, I found myself needing to look at him one last time. My eyes locked with his lifeless black circles for barely a couple seconds before I threw him into the chipper. It spluttered slightly as his tiny body passed through it, pulverizing him. All that came out the other side were shredded bits of the cloth and stuffing that had constituted his physical form. With the deed done, I ran back to my car as fast as I could and sped away from that strange place. A year went by. I got on with my life, back to my old routine, forcing myself to believe that I'd experienced some kind of psychotic episode. I'd returned from my travels with a resolve to forbid myself from thinking about it any further, something I was surprisingly able to achieve to a modest degree. There were, of course, those more painful nights where the images came flooding in like a dam had burst in my mind. The miniature plastic furniture, the box, the key, Alex. Those nights were difficult, but I survived them by sheer commitment to my routine the next day. I would get up and act as if there was nothing to worry about. And often, I was pleased to discover, it began to feel as if there wasn't. Until one day, when I was sitting in my living room reading a book, I heard what sounded like someone walking up to my front door. When I looked over, all I could see through the frosted glass panel was the silhouette of a child, just standing there. I thought maybe it was a neighborhood kid about to ring the doorbell and then run away. It wouldn't have been the first time. But instead, the silhouette just stood there, perfectly still. I got up and went over to the door, but as soon as I opened it, whoever had been there vanished. I looked around. No one on the street. But there simply hadn't been enough time for whoever it was to scurry off and hide. But then I looked down and saw something had been left on my porch. It was a small, decorative box, exactly like the one I dug up in the hotel garden whilst on my travels. I felt sick as I approached it, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was inside. I opened it. Inside was Alex. I cowered when I saw what had become of him. He now had crude stitches which zigzagged across his face and body, as if he'd been put back together by some unforgiving surgical butcher. He was swollen and thin in the wrong places, as if his insides had been rearranged incorrectly, giving him a perverse, disturbing shape. One of the buttons that had been his eyes was missing, and he now stared ahead blankly, with the single black ring of a motionless Cyclops. Still watching me. Always watching me.